George Knapp is KLAS TV's television anchorman for Channel 8 in Las Vegas and a much-respected investigative reporter. George has made 2 visits to the former Soviet Union and returned with an astonishing tale to tell. It was he who conducted the very first televised interview with Bob Lazar, and before very long, the entire world wanted to know more about a certain facility known as Area 51. Ladies and gentlemen, he's travelled several thousand miles to share some of that information with you here today, making his first ever lecture appearance in Britain. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. George Knapp.
Good night, Joe. Thank you very much. I've been in London since Thursday, and I keep hearing about this numerous times over and over about this alien you have in your government. I think he's from the planet Vulcan. I was quite disappointed to see that Mr. Redwood's name is not on the list of speakers here, but it is a pretty distinguished name list nonetheless. Very wonderful to be back in your great city. I was here 3 years ago wearing a suit and tie and doing all this television business, running around, and it was in a heat wave that was described as your most intense heat wave since the Spanish Armada. So I come back this time. I arrived Thursday morning. I'm dressed Las Vegas style with a pair of shorts and a T-shirt. It's rain, it's wind, it's cold. I couldn't get into the hotel until about 2 in the afternoon, so I'm wandering around freezing various body parts, and to the point where I'm not sure I'll ever father any children. Anyway, as Graham said earlier today, 50 years of UFOs, 50 years of ufology, and we're asking a lot of questions, but we still have very few of the really big answers. The phenomenon we know is genuine. A small percentage of the cases represent something like an alien intelligence. However, I think most ufologists would agree about 95% of the cases you hear about and much of what you read about is complete nonsense. However, the phenomenon is real. We still don't know who they are, why they're here, where we fit into the big picture. There is one big question, though, that I think we can answer, and that's the question of cover-up. Peter and Larry are certainly a pretty tough act to follow, but I think what I have to say this afternoon complements some of the things that they have been telling us about for the past hour and a half or so. The question of a cover-up. Certainly the best evidence concerning ufology, UFOs, the alien presence is in the hands of government. There's no question about that. Only governments have satellite detection systems and radar, military intelligence capabilities, warplanes armed with gun cameras. Civilians don't have these things, so the best evidence must be in the hands of governments. However, world governments have chosen to keep the information to themselves, telling the public over and over again that there's nothing to it. For the past 5 years, I've attempted to gain access to whatever UFO files might exist in Russia. In 1993, I and my colleagues succeeded to a degree in penetrating Russia's UFO secrecy. In 1996, I returned to Moscow with a London television crew, a company called Four Winds Production, which put together an excellent program for the Discovery Channel, and we succeeded again in uncovering even more information. But in between those 2 trips, something happened to change the makeup, the political makeup of Russia dramatically. That window of opportunity, which I was able to exploit in 1993, had nearly closed by 1996. Still, I think you'll find that our findings during those 2 journeys are dramatic by almost any standard. The great Russian leader Lenin, in a conversation with H.G. Wells, once predicted that confirmed contact with extraterrestrials would change everything and might even render the communist revolution itself irrelevant. Well, of course, the revolution is largely irrelevant in Russia today, but UFO activity persists there, and so does official interest in flying saucers. This we can prove. The American CIA finances something called the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, the FBIS, which summarizes foreign news stories for consumption by American intelligence agencies. The FBIS reports are not classified, however, they are not widely available. In early 1991, several FBIS reports focused on astonishing accounts of UFOs within Russia. Astonishing because of the public statements made by top-level Russian military figures. One of those figures was General Igor Maltsev, who for 7 years was the chief of staff of Soviet air defenses. According to Russian news accounts, General Maltsev had submitted a stunning report to the Ministry of Defense a report which focused on a series of UFO events over Moscow in 1990, March. General Maltsev had never spoken about his report to journalists, Western or Russian, that is, until 1996. If we could roll part of the first tape. We were able to meet with General Maltsev, this distinguished-looking man you're about to see here. We were able to meet with him in an office near the Kremlin. Turn it down, the sound is not. To our knowledge, he is the highest-ranking Russian military official to ever reveal to Westerners any details about UFO encounters in the former USSR. He confirmed for us the following. On a single night in March 1990, his forces reported more than 100 visual observations of UFOs over Moscow. The air defense system was placed on high alert. Fighters were scrambled. Radar confirmed the presence of unidentified objects, and thousands on the ground saw the UFOs. Maltsev told us the UFOs could appear and disappear at will. You can stop the tape there. Appear and disappear at will. They could travel at many times the speed of any known aircraft. His planes tried to intercept them at one point, but couldn't get close. He told us the objects were completely silent. They performed maneuvers unknown in modern aviation. They would appear to be, in his words, devoid of inertia, as if they had mastered gravity. He reiterated that since these were not stealth or other known aircraft, they were truly unknown, not made on Earth to his knowledge. And he confirmed that his forces had been given a standing order after that: observe but do not fire upon the UFOs because, again, in his words, they may possess incredible capacities for retaliation. In other words, we shoot at them, they kick our butts. This order, he said, remains in effect today. Oddly, General Maltsev would go no further in our interview. He denied knowledge of any other UFO events in the Soviet Union. He said he knew nothing of any classified studies or rumored UFO crashes that had taken place. But he insisted all along that he was in a position to know. If they had happened, he should have known about them, but said he didn't. He should have known, he said, about any kind of incursion into Russian airspace. Well, either he was not being very candid, or UFO information in the former Soviet Union was compartmentalized to the extreme. Maltsev claimed ignorance of numerous UFO documents, studies, and incidents, including the following. If we can roll that tape again. 1968, Latvia, a film crew photographed this gigantic flying triangle, similar in shape to some of the triangular UFOs seen over Belgium in 1989, and more recently, just this year, in Arizona in the U.S. The skeptics say this looks like a French weather balloon, and it does. The French, however, say we didn't have any balloons in that area. The KGB kept that footage secret in a vault for 25 years. Still rolling? Just let it roll. May of 1982, a military team on a surveying mission in the Kola Peninsula filmed this spinning object, which I've highlighted, as you'll see, and dubbed over at half speed a couple of times. Similar objects have been reported in other parts of Russia, as well as in other parts of Europe and in California, but you tell me what kind of conventional craft that resembles. I don't know of any. This next object is kind of a fuzzy photograph that was shot in the Ural Mountains in 1976. Photographer shot this disc-shaped object. He later did some artwork and kind of filled in some of the details. These were forwarded to the files of the Ministry of Defense. Next photo you're going to see is of a decorated Russian lieutenant colonel who had reported that while piloting a MiG, he encountered a UFO. He attempted to intercept it. In his report, again forwarded to the Ministry of Defense, following that encounter, he told his superiors the UFO shot out a beam of light which disabled his plane. He bailed out and survived. The report was kept secret. Other mid-air encounters. This is a MiG. This photo also from the MOD files. The pilot of this MiG reported a mid-air collision with a UFO, a disc-shaped UFO which damaged his wing. This is an official photo of a brush fire, which isn't all that exciting, except for the Army officers who reported it said it was started by a UFO. Two schoolboys north of Moscow took a series of 8 photos of this object. In the air, it looks like a classic flying disc. In later photos, and I've seen the entire sequence, It gets closer to the ground and the shape seems to change. It becomes sort of an amorphous blob there by the end, right before it took off. 1991, controllers at the Leningrad airport detected 1, then 2, then 3 UFOs hovering over a nuclear power plant. Here's a tape of that incident. If you could turn up the sound.
These are the actual tapes made on that day. They've never been broadcast before. Listen to their voices. You can hear the excitement of the controllers about what they're seeing. Is it single, or are there a few of them? Looks like a group. We have 2 or 3 spots now. The controllers have never seen anything like it. Look how fast it's moving. What is the speed? What is it? It's 3,154 kilometers per hour. That is almost 2,000 miles an hour. No plane known to man can travel at that speed from a dead stop.
Okay, you can stop that tape now. Now, General Maltsev, who said he should have known about every incursion into Soviet military airspace, said he didn't know anything about any of these, even though they were obtained from official military files. We had attempted to obtain an interview with General Maltsev's superior, a man who was the Deputy Minister of Defense and a Commander-in-Chief of all air defenses, General Ivan Tretyak. And the reason we wanted to talk to him is because General Tretyak his name had also turned up in some of those FBIS reports. He'd been quoted in Russian newspapers following the 1990 UFO sightings that General Maltsev talked about, and generally, General Tretyak was trying to throw cold water on the whole thing, trying to calm down the public. He said that most UFO cases are explainable, blah, blah, blah. He admitted some UFOs are not explainable. They cannot be detected on radar. They cannot be intercepted, but they have been photographed by the military. We tried to get some of those photographs and were unsuccessful. He confirmed that the standing order, don't shoot at UFOs, still stands today. We tried several times to talk him into giving us an interview on camera. In the end, he told me the Ministry of Defense had informed him that, quote, it would not be in anyone's interest at this time to talk publicly about UFOs, perhaps in a year or two. CBS News, whom I worked with as a consultant for a while, also tried to get General Tretyak and then also tried to get comments in general out of the Ministry of Defense, and we're told, in the exact words of the Ministry of Defense, the MOD does not comment on UFOs. The limited statements of General Maltsev and General Tretyak, while certainly interesting, set the tone for our 1996 investigation, with tantalizing hints that there's a lot more behind the scenes, a lot more information to be had, but not now. That was a marked change from just 3 years before when we first met there. We found considerable success at cracking the Kremlin's UFO secrets. Some cases from the Russia's Ministry of Defense. November 1989, 3 military pilots in pursuit of a fast-moving UFO were exposed to intense beams of hot light from an object which zoomed away at incredible speeds. The pilots were subsequently hospitalized. Over a period of several weeks, they became virtually invalids and died of symptoms similar to radiation poisoning. June 15th, 1980, Moscow. Dozens of military personnel, observed a bright egg-shaped UFO perform high-speed maneuvers and incredible turns, appearing, disappearing, and hovering over the city. One officer got within 50 meters of this egg-shaped UFO, but was repelled by something he described as a force field. Also June 1980, in the town of Volsk, 20 different witnesses in 7 different groups, including military witnesses, reported several UFOs, including a luminous sphere which split into 2 objects. One of the 2 hovered over the town, emitting this bright beam of light like a searchlight toward the ground. Another object flew in a zigzag pattern. Auto engines and radio signals on the ground below were knocked out. The same objects were seen 6 more times over the next 4 months over that same town. But the most dramatic incident of all occurred on the night of October 4th, 1982. The village of Yusovo in the Soviet Ukraine. Dozens of witnesses, most of whom are military personnel, including several officers, reported a UFO free-for-all in the skies above Yusovo for a period of nearly 4 hours. Some of the objects were triangular. Some of them were elliptical. Some changed colors. Others changed shapes. Some split into smaller objects. Some merged into a larger object. Some of them blinked on, blinked off, performed outrageous maneuvers. All of these witness statements were collected, stamped, and then classified and sent to the Ministry of Defense in Moscow with great urgency. The reason for that, the UFOs were maneuvering over a nuclear missile base. Sort of goes along with what Larry and Peter were telling us a little bit ago. Long-range nuclear missiles. Included in this classified report was the most disturbing statement of all. It was provided by a communications commander named Davidovich Katzman, who reported that while the UFOs hovered over this missile base, the launch control panel that was in front of him was somehow activated. In his words, it was a spontaneous illumination of all the displays, and someone or something entered the precise control codes, which enabled these missiles. In other words, the missiles were ready to launch. The Russians didn't do it. But then the UFOs disappeared. Control panel goes back to normal. Ministry of Defense emergency team comes in to investigate. They concluded the UFOs were somehow responsible for what had occurred, as if to send a message. This may be your most powerful weapon system, but it doesn't impress us all that much. The same message, of course, was delivered to the United States military in 1975. According to Pentagon documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, 5 of our nuclear bases were visited, one right after another, over a two-week period by UFOs which, quote, had a clear intent in the weapons storage area. In at least one of those cases, the UFOs somehow manipulated the launch codes of our ICBMs. So contrary to what's been said about UFOs publicly by the governments of the U.S., Great Britain, and Russia and others, UFOs do carry serious national security implications. However, with the end of the Cold War, we have seen no change in the attitude of governments on the UFO topic. For decades, they have justified their excessive secrecy, their excessive expenditures on the grounds of national security. They couldn't tell us what's going on, but it's all been in our best interests. Well, Groom Lake, Nevada is one of the places where that Cold War was won. You probably know it better as Area 51. As mentioned in the introduction, I'm sort of the journalist that put Area 51 on the map to the point where the world beat a path to its door, and it's now the least secret base in the world. The word is definitely out, but instead of relaxing things a little bit, instead of admitting the base even exists, instead of saying, hey, good job, well done by all, admitting that the place is there, the U.S. military has taken the opposite approach. It has seized further public land to prevent American citizens, the people paying the bills for that base, from peering down to see what goes on there, even though the United States is a signatory to something called the Open Skies Treaty, which allows any other signatory nation to fly over that base and take all the pictures they want. Anyone who gets too close is likely to encounter these nasty security personnel carrying automatic weapons. Worse still is how the base has treated its own workers. Allow me a brief diversion, and we'll come back to Russia in just a moment, but I wanted to set up the Russia trip with a look at what the attitudes of my own government concerning the Area 51 situation. This is a recent update I produced, actually last year, and to give you a feel for what has been happening in Nevada, if we could put in the second tape. If you don't know a lot about Area 51, this will bring you up to date on that as well.
Well, there's several.
Yeah, we need audio on that.
Flying saucers, flying discs.
The interview that launched 1,000 business ventures. Bob Lazar's 1989 claims that he saw flying saucers housed and tested near Groom Lake caused ripples which are still being felt. At least 4 movie projects, dozens of screenplays, a few books, T-shirts and bumper stickers, artwork, a rock band, a Las Vegas bar, a viewer's guide, a research center, countless news reports, even a Bob Lazar Christmas ornament. Not bad for a place that until last year didn't officially exist. The military now admits what the world already knew. It has a, quote, operating location near Groom Lake. But the Pentagon says the base has no name. By denying the place has a name, the Defense Department hopes to stall a lawsuit filed by former workers who claim they were exposed to toxic chemicals there. The lawyer who filed the suit thinks it's ridiculous.
You just can't have black places. You can't have places that don't exist. The government cannot create these secret enclaves in which it and it alone determines what laws will govern.
Despite official denials, the common name for the base has always been Area 51. We recently found this 1967 government map which lists that name. Subsequent maps left the name blank. We also found a 70s newspaper article in which the Pentagon mentions Area 51 by name. What's it called today? High-level sources say the military uses the term score event to refer to it. Who runs the base? The CIA built it for use in the U-2 program. This is rare footage taken from Groom Lake of some early tests. Current warning signs indicate it's an Air Force facility, but all branches of the military have used it, along with most major defense contractors. The common thread has always been EG&G, which has had the contract to operate the facility since the beginning. What goes on there today? Plenty. Highly placed sources say the base employs about 1,800 people. One of their main missions is to evaluate Russian defense systems, equipment that's in the hands of unfriendly nations like Iran and Iraq. Another program at 51 is the stealth helicopter, although the technology isn't far along. As for flying saucers, the military admits it has built these unmanned craft. It may not be a coincidence that the Air Force's only unmanned aerial vehicle squadron is based at Nellis. Whatever is flying around out there still attracts visitors from all over the world.
It's still newsworthy in Europe?
Yes. No, also in Europe, Area 51 is well known.
I'll let the tape roll.
Look how bright it's getting. Look at it now.
This 1989 home video of a glowing orb above Area 51 is the first, but certainly not the last, taken of odd objects in the Nevada desert. Scientist Bob Lazar said he knew where to set up his camera because he worked at Papoose Lake, south of Groom Lake, but still inside Area 51. Lazar said he saw 9 flying discs of alien origin hidden in hillside hangars.
There were 9 total that I saw, each one being different. Like they had the assortment pack.
Lazar's controversial statement set off a stampede that continues to this day. People come by the busload to Groom Lake to watch the skies.
This is a classic mothership appearance.
Nearby, the rustic town of Rachel became a UFO hotspot. The town's bar and grill became the Little Ailey Inn, whose walls are adorned with alien drawings and poster-sized photos of the base. A full line of UFO merchandise, including videos, T-shirts, antimatter hats, and ET welcome mats, is for sale.
Hordes of people come out here.
Yeah, from all over?
From all over.
Owner Joe Travis has given more interviews than he can remember to news crews from all over the world. This crew from Switzerland, for example, arrived just this week. Public interest remains high, even though the government has seized vantage points once used to peer down on the base. Area 51 is off limits, but people still see weird lights in the sky.
Straight up.
Photos have captured glowing globs, sombrero-shaped craft, dual objects with rows of lights, things which make unusual maneuvers.
If anything, it's increased over the past month. You know, it's just every week, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. People come in and say they have to see this orange globe, orb, whatever you want to call it.
Today, the base is hidden, protected by motion detectors, security forces, and the Groom Mountains, but also by the mountains of legal briefs filed by the Pentagon. A lawsuit by 6 former employees alleges the military endangered workers by illegally disposing of hazardous waste at Area 51. The government has used national security as grounds to stall the suit. It denied the base existed, denied it has a name, even denied having such hazardous materials as jet fuel and car batteries, although both jets and cars have been photographed there, as seen in this previously classified film. President Clinton recently signed an order exempting the base from environmental laws, but the lawyer who filed the suit doesn't think it will matter in the long run.
From the very beginning, the military has adopted an absolutist position in this case, that they and they alone will dictate what information the public receives. This opinion is of something of a wake-up call.
Okay, you can change tapes now. This order by President Clinton is incredible. I mean, we have environmental laws in our country that are supposed to be enforced, and suddenly, when it looks like the people running Area 51 are going to be nailed for violating that and endangering the health of their own workers, something they could have settled out of court very quietly, they go to President Clinton, who exempts the whole thing. I have to stick up for my employer, KLAS TV, because at my suggestion, they have entered this lawsuit on behalf of the employees. The government has tried to seal all the proceedings in this case, even though it should be public documents. We've been fighting that. Now, the case has now proceeded to our Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the level just below our Supreme Court. it will end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. There's no question about it. Whether there are UFOs out there or not, the issues, the national security issues of whether the government can use the excuse of national security to hide evidence of its own crimes is of supreme importance to the American people. To me, though, the message oozing out of Groom Lake is as clear as it can be. It doesn't matter that the Cold War is over, that the walls have fallen, that the world has changed. It doesn't matter. The United States, the military, is not going to ease its secrecy, certainly is not going to come clean on UFOs. That kind of realization has really got me started looking and thinking about Russia. Because I knew from the writings of a few other very brave ufologists who'd been over there that the Russians had probably done a lot of the same things we suspected the American government had done, and perhaps your government as well. That is, conduct secret UFO studies, lie to the public, spread disinformation, spy on UFO researchers, infiltrate UFO organizations, and completely muddy the waters to the point where reasonable people just don't know what to believe. My guess was that if I could gain access to the Russian files somehow, I might end up learning more about what the Americans know about UFOs from the Russians than we'd ever learn from the Americans, if you can follow that. And that's exactly what occurred. Please cue the next tape. I like this countdown here. Anyway, allow me to set the stage further for our first UFO fact-finding trip. Is the tape still running? Yeah. Dramatic historical events were unfolding in Russia in 1993. The entire country was embroiled in this political turmoil. In Moscow, there were daily demonstrations like this. The pro-communist forces were still alive. A lot of people wanted to return to the old ways. The pro-democracy forces were faced with this kind of thing almost every day. There were clashes in the streets and mass demonstrations. There were bombings that were never reported in the West. You'll see some video here in a second about troops on the move in Moscow. Again, things that were not reported in the West. On the day we arrived, Boris Yeltsin had ordered the seizure of the broadcast airwaves, and on the day we left, the Russian Parliament was meeting to consider his impeachment. So it was a very interesting time to be there for a journalist, whether there were any UFOs involved or not. Today, the scene has changed. No more mass demonstrations, no more open unrest like this, but things, I will tell you, are very bad there. The gap between the rich and poor in just 3 years grew even more dramatically. Organized crime is virtually out of control, running the country. Stop this tape, by the way, when you go to black here. The communists have made a comeback. In fact, when we went there in April of last year, Boris Yeltsin was 20 points down to the communists. That's how bad things were. People were considering returning to that despotic system. The nationalists were causing a lot of nasty noise. Yeltsin, even today, has a very tenuous grip on power, as tenuous as his bad health. The Russians, in other words, don't know what's going to happen from day to day, and many of them are frightened. And I think that really spilled over into what we were able to accomplish this last time around. Our success in gaining access to Russia's inner circles that first time, though, was made possible by a man named Dr. Nikolai Kapranov. He is a Russian physicist who was a national security advisor to the Russian Parliament as well as to their National Academy of Sciences. He was in the United States to lecture at various places on disarmament issues, places like Los Alamos National Lab, and I met him in Las Vegas through the help of a United States congressman from Nevada. Figured I'd ask him if he'd ever heard anything about UFOs. He said, no, we started having a couple of beers. He says, no, I don't really know anything about UFOs, never really paid any attention. And then as we sat there a little longer, he said, but I do have a KGB friend who said something about a secret UFO report. And now that you mention it, there's a friend of mine in Ministry of Defense who said something about a study that was underway. I asked him, you want to give it a try to help us crack this secret? And he said, sure. It took about 7 months before we were ready to travel over there. One of our most important guideline for Dr. Kapranov was this one: seek out people who were in positions to know about UFOs, but had never been out peddling their stories to anyone. No one who had ever been on any of the tabloid television programs, no professional ufologists to speak of. We want people who were in a position to know, but have not been out blabbing about it. Well, that guideline seemed to open many doors for us. If you want to put in, start the next tape. Start this tape again. It seemed to open many doors for us and convinced many of our news sources that we were very serious people. Perhaps the most important door which it opened for us is this one, the one which led to this modest apartment of a man named Boris Sokolov, a retired Red Army colonel from a distinguished military family. In the late 1970s, Colonel Sokolov was part of an elite handful of officers charged with adapting industrial technologies to military purposes. His area of concentration was radio waves and radio astronomy. As we will learn, you can stop it right there for just a second, the Soviet military had long been monitoring UFO activity, but some spectacular sightings in the late 1970s on the Russian-Finnish border had really prompted direct action. Okay. Very well. 1, 2. Is this working? All right. Anyway, in the late 1970s, there had been this fairly spectacular UFO incident on the Russian-Finnish border at a place called Petrozavodsk. So following that, in 1978, an amazing order was issued by the Soviet Ministry of Defense. The order was sent out to every military unit in the vast Soviet military empire, Army, Navy, the whole works. And the order said, in Sokolov's words, this order transformed the entire USSR into one gigantic UFO listening post. Simply put, the order stated that every UFO sighting, every UFO encounter, every disc-shaped object, every anomalous aircraft, every ball of light, everything weird that you see in the sky had to be fully investigated, witnesses interrogated, evidence collected, and all of those reports were sent to a central location, central study that was headed by Colonel Sokolov in the Ministry of Defense. Sokolov said that thousands and thousands of reports poured into his office because the study lasted a full 10 years. And in his words, a study like this can probably, of this magnitude, can never be undertaken again. For one thing, the USSR itself no longer exists. Here is Colonel Sokolov. You can start the tape. Here is Colonel Sokolov speaking about some of the highlights of those reports and why the study was undertaken in the first place. And you might be amazed.
The military was interested for 3 reasons. 1, because of the unpredictable movement of the UFOs, the quick changes in course angles. 2, because of the velocity of the UFO movements. And 3, because UFOs observed visually could not be seen on radar, and those seen on radar could not always be seen visually. The military thought that if the secrets of the UFOs could be discovered, they would be able to win the competition against our prospective enemies in terms of velocity, materials, and visibility. Stealth. To build their own stealth. Pilots recognized UFOs as a threat to them. There were 40 episodes in which they shot at UFOs. An order was given to pilots to chase UFOs and shoot at them. But when the pilots tried, the UFOs speeded up. In 3 cases, the pilots would lose control and crash. 2 of the pilots died. After that, pilots received a new order. When they see a UFO, change course and get out. All the pilots agreed. October 5th, 1983. I was ordered to immediately go to the Ukraine to an ICBM base. The reason for the urgency was a report from the base commander to the chief of the general staff. On October 4th, from 4 to 8 p.m., the base observed a UFO. At the same time, on the control panel, they received an order to prepare the launch of the ICBMs. The lights lit up, and the launch codes enabled the missiles. Dozens of officers witnessed this.
You can stop the tape there. A couple of other points to make about Colonel Sokolov. He said in addition to those 40 pilot encounters, there were dozens of incidents in which ground forces fired on UFOs, in which UFOs caused car and plane engines at military bases to stall, knocked out radios, radar, telephone, clipped the wings of planes, and immobilized personnel. Colonel Sokolov also added something else somewhat cryptically. He said that the Ministry of Defense study of UFOs is still ongoing, although that unlike the one in the United States, the Russian study was passive. I asked what he meant. He said, you know, the Russians were not actively out looking for UFOs. If one flew over a military base, we'd take a report and send it to Sokolov's office. Unlike the United States, he said, which had built 30 tracking stations around the world for the express purpose of keeping an eye on UFOs. He also admits that most of the UFO reports that came to his desk first went through a KGB attachment as part of every Russian military unit, so it's possible some of the more sensitive cases never made it to his eyes. However, in all likelihood, he saw more UFO information than anyone else in that 10-year period. Of the thousands of reports compiled during those 10 years, Sokolov culled what he considered to be some of the most interesting, a few hundred incidents, and amazingly allowed us to acquire them. Couple of the highlights. There was one case in which a Russian army colonel encountered a UFO in Moscow. When the colonel tried to approach it, he says he was frozen by a beam of light, blacked out, woke up 2 hours later. Classic missing time kind of a case. This is in the Ministry of Defense files. Another incident, 1990, involved mystery helicopters, similar to what's been reported in the West in connection with cattle mutilation incidents. The mystery choppers flew real low, made no noise, and were piloted by two beings whom the witnesses assumed were wearing strange masks because their faces were so strange. A third document referred cryptically to some unusual material recovered from a crash site, and we'll get more into that in a little bit. Obviously, in 1996, we're going back to retrace some of my steps from 1993, and this British crew would like to interview Colonel Sokolov, a key to the program they wanted to put together. I was curious as well what had happened to Colonel Sokolov because in the interim, I knew he had taken a real beating in the Russian press. There are still communist forces at work in that country, still very strong, and there was a very jealous ufologist who wrote a nasty article that was printed in a leading leftist-leaning newspaper, and it really took Colonel Sokolov to task for revealing the secrets of the motherland. Well, Nikolai Kapranov, the guy who had got us in there, confided to us, if this had happened 5 years ago, we would all have been in jail. And if it happened 10 years before, we would all have been shot. I had heard that Colonel Sokolov was having health problems as well. Turns out he was having health problems, but he really wanted to avoid us because he didn't want to get in any more trouble. So it ended up, although we made several attempts to find him in 1996, he would not agree to meet with us. Even more telling, Nikolai, who had become a pretty good friend of mine, also would not meet with us. Despite repeated phone calls to his residence, at first his wife and family would answer for him, and then no one would answer the phone at all. And it was sort of a telling sign that we would see more of. The idea that Russians were studying UFOs in order to learn stealth technology, as Colonel Sokolov suggested, was kind of intriguing to me because there had been rumors about that sort of thing out at Area 51, that some of the stealth technology that had been nurtured at that base had in fact been derived from flying saucers. The same rumor has been applied about SDI or Star Wars research, that it might also be linked to alien technology. And we were able to find, through our connections with the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences, a man named Dr. Ramily Avramenko. He was, and perhaps still is, one of the chief scientists for the Russians working on their version of SDI, and anti-satellite weapons programs, which, considering the research that's been done on this campus, is kind of ironic if you think about it. For much of his life, Dr. Avramenko says, he hasn't even been able to use his real name. If he wanted to publish a scientific article or anything else, he had to use an alias. He said, he told us in no uncertain terms, UFOs are real, that we, meaning the West, and the Russians have known they're real for decades, and that the information has been incorporated into SDI research. If we could roll the tape further. Same tape. He even demonstrated what he said was a plasma, a form of a plasma beam weapon, a tabletop model. We had walked into this room. I think he was just trying to get our attention. As I saw this blue plastic thing sitting there, nothing was plugged in, and then he puts a razor blade on top of it. And perhaps there's a simpler explanation, I don't know, than this being a plasma weapon. But you'll see what it can do here in just a second. Blew a pretty good hole in this little razor blade here. Anyway, Dr. Avramenko, after this shot here, will tell us what else he knows about UFOs.
The first time I saw UFOs was in 1959. I saw it with radar as it was orbiting Earth. In 1959, the first good radars were made. We could see several thousand kilometers. We could see what was happening around the Earth. At the time, satellites were easily countable, but we also saw vehicles whose technical characteristics we can't match even now. We saw tens of these in 1959, entering and leaving Earth's atmosphere. Surely the existence of these UFOs caused problems for the U.S. defense system. You were faced with separating aggressive vehicles from the unknowns. Are aliens and UFOs real? For me and my colleagues, that isn't even a question. I know this government has many programs on this. The information about UFOs helps us manufacture plasma beams for use in our Star Wars. The weapons of the aliens, we call them.
Well, that was then. It was a different story in 1996. 1993, Dr. Avramenko is more than willing to cooperate with us and tell us astonishing things like that. 1996, we couldn't even get a wisp of his trail, have no idea where he was. None of the people who had helped us before were willing to help us find him again. Both Colonel Sokolov and Dr. Avramenko had told us that military studies of UFOs were still underway, and with the help of our friend Nikolai, who again wouldn't talk to us this time, we met with the man who is currently in charge of an ongoing study. By agreement back then, I couldn't reveal his name. However, since then, he's given me permission to do so. His name is Alexander Plaksin. He's a lieutenant colonel in the Russian Air Force. And with his help, we were able to obtain some additional documents which are still classified in Russia. One of these days, I'll tell you the story how you get classified documents out of Russia. It's a good adventure in and of itself. What these documents reveal, however, is an ongoing, high-level, dead serious interest in UFOs by the Russian military. In the documents, there are numerous references to American ufology, and it's clear that they are monitoring developments over here and around the world. There were references in the documents to such things as MJ-12. It's not saying that MJ-12 necessarily is real or that the Russians believe it's real, but it does indicate that they're paying attention to things that are appearing in our Western press concerning UFOs. Concerning the question of UFO reality, it's not even a matter of discussion in these classified documents. Yes, they admit many UFOs are misidentifications, but the Russians are focusing not on what it all means or the cosmic implications. They're focusing more on how do we duplicate this technology and get ahead of the West. The name of that ongoing study in 1993 was Thread 3. One enlightening section of the papers contains a detailed account of UFO sightings by Soviet cosmonauts. You know, we've often wondered what American astronauts have seen up in space. You get a lot of conflicting reports about it. Well, the Russians in these Thread 3 documents had some very detailed accounts of what their cosmonauts had seen, and it starts right in the beginning. Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Gagarin is quoted in the documents as saying, UFOs are real, they fly at incredible speeds, and he could tell more about them if given permission to do so. The second Russian in space, also mentioned in these documents, cosmonaut Titov. He took along a film camera on his shot into space, and he photographed a small fleet of UFOs as they danced around and under and in front of his space capsule. I was able to see one frame of that film. It does seem to show, you can't really make it out, they're balls of light, but it's clearly something out there in space in close proximity to his capsule. In 1990, there were further interviews with more recent Russian cosmonauts, again reprinted in the FBIS reports, in which they say they looked down and saw huge UFOs on more than one occasion. Also in these classified documents, the Thread 3 reports information about American UFO encounters in space, including references to things that were seen on the moon by U.S. astronauts and how this information was removed from NASA's public files. The Russians even did their own analysis of America's data that was going back and forth between our moon missions and Houston control. They think it really happened. That we haven't returned to the moon because there was some kind of an encounter up there and we were warned to stay away. I don't know if I believe it or not. I'm just telling you what the Russians had in these classified documents that were never supposed to see the light of day. We did meet with Colonel Plaksin again this time. That was one of our success stories. So we were able to get more information out of him. He said Thread 3 ended in 1995, but another study under something called Group 22 continues on a lesser scale in Russia. The Air Force has been using National Academy of Sciences labs to analyze different UFO incidents. Plaksin says he has not been told to be quiet. Hasn't been given any orders to that effect. He's, in fact, written articles not dealing with UFOs so much as anomalous lights and plasmoids and things of that nature. So we know the Russians have been studying UFOs. They're studying them now. We know they've studied the subject at least back to the late 70s. How far back does it go? And what can it tell us about U.S. knowledge of UFOs? There's one man in Russia who can answer these questions. His name is Dr. Valery Budakov. And I know all these names got to be running together in your head by now. Bear with me. Dr. Valery Budakov had been mentioned once or twice in articles here in the West, all based on a single interview that he had given to a Russian journalist some years ago. Until we hooked up with him in 1993, at least to my knowledge, he had never spoken publicly, certainly not with a Western journalist, about some of the things you're going to hear. Of course, one of the big questions in ufology is about UFOs and crashes. Was Roswell real? Did the Russians have any cases like that? And Dr. Budakov was a man in a position to give us some insight into that. He had trained in the 1950s at the prestigious Moscow Aviation Institute, which is where Sputnik was designed and where the Soviet space program was born. He fell under the wing of a man named Sergei Korolev, who's the father of Russian rocketry, founder of the Russian space program. Korolev and Budakov both had an interest in ufology, in UFOs, and subsequently were able to sit down and talk about it. If you want to roll the tape again. Dr. Korolev confided in Dr. Budakov about how far back interest in ufology really went in Russia.
Korolev told me that in 1948 he was invited to the Kremlin to see Stalin. This was after the events in New Mexico and after the death of Captain Mantell. Stalin brought Korolev into a room where all the materials were spread on a table. Western periodicals, books, articles, UFO reports from the Soviet Union, information from special channels in the U.S. Stalin wanted to know, what did Korolev think about the material concerning Roswell and UFOs? Korolev asked to take the materials home to study them and was told no. He had to work there. When Korolev finished the work, Stalin asked him again his opinion. Korolev said the phenomenon is real. They do not appear to be dangerous to our country. They are not manufactured in the States or any other country. And the time will come when it must be further studied. Stalin thanked him and said the same opinion was shared by other specialists. We know that the U.S. Air Force possesses plenty of material about UFOs. We know the U.S. Navy also has plenty of material. We know about special orders given to keep all of the material secret. When curious people ask for the materials, they are told they're not there. For the near future, the most interesting materials will be kept secret. The owners of the material don't let it out.
And stop the tape there. Again, that was then. Completely different story in 1996. In preparation for this conference, I went back and checked my original notes to make sure I wasn't making a mistake. But Dr. Budakov had said back then that the conclusion of the Russian government, Stalin, his advisors, was that Roswell was a craft from somewhere else. We didn't make it on Earth. It was alien for all intents and purposes. This time around, Dr. Budakov, it was like speaking to a different person. He was very, very eager, first of all, to promote some of the books that he was writing in the West, and then he said of his totally different view of Roswell, well, I should say views of Roswell, it might have been a saucer, but if it was a saucer, it was probably made by some of the Nazi scientists who were working at White Sands Missile Base. In more likelihood, it was a V-2 rocket test, and those reports about alien bodies, it was probably green monkeys which were shot up in the V-2s in those days. So completely changed his tune on Roswell, and I really don't understand why, other than this idea of the uncertainty of the times for the Russian people. American debunkers have provided a lot of air cover for those scientists who simply do not want to study UFOs by poo-pooing the entire subject without the benefit of doing any research. They give ammunition to those scientists who want to claim they don't study UFOs because there isn't anything to study there. There's no evidence. People like the late Carl Sagan tell us over and over there's nothing to it, it's all in our heads. Or James Oberg, who's become something of an expert on the Soviet rocketry program, saying the same kind of a thing. Well, I had an opportunity to meet with Russia's premier UFO skeptic. It's a scientist named Dr. Yuli Platov. He works at something called the Institute for Terrestrial Magnetism, and for the past several years, he's been the point man for Russia's Academy of Sciences on the UFO study. If you want to start this video. Dr. Platov informed us of the history of UFO studies in Russia. He said their National Academy of Sciences began formal studies back in the 70s, that 10 different scientific institutions have been involved in the studies, that thousands of case files have been accumulated, along with photos and drawings, and that there is general agreement among Russian scientists that the topic is worthy of study, unlike what we see in the West. In our 1993 meeting, Platov described himself as a friendly skeptic. By that he means well over 90% of cases can be explained. He showed us some of his files, and that's a figure that most Western ufologists would also embrace. Some of the photos he showed us are fairly dramatic. One case in particular has been reported here in the West. It deals with a UFO that landed on a frozen lake in Russia and took off. It left behind these large circular impressions in the ice. Now, witnesses saw this thing, the ice was analyzed, and he thinks that's one of the best cases they have. The case remains unexplained so far. He also mentioned that the Russians had seen dozens of what they have, their version of crop circles over there, but he didn't have reports on those. He sums up his attitude, after giving me several dozen of his case study files, summed up his attitude by saying that science should be interested in pursuing the unexplained, that the prospect of ET life is very important, and we have to follow the evidence where it leads. Well, again, that was then. We met with Dr. Platov again this time. He virtually wrote off the entire UFO subject, something he's been studying for 20 years himself. He said that there is only one case that's unexplained, and that's the frozen lake case. All the others can be explained. We were able to show him a couple of videos that we brought along for him to analyze just on the spot, and he just dismissed them almost with a wave of his hand. So he had become a much more hardened skeptic in just the 3-year period. And you got me why. A couple of other quick names here. Professor Rem Varlamov, if you can handle another name, our next witness. Rem Varlamov, one of the founders of Russian ufology, one of the only ufologists we spoke to over there, currently teaches at Moscow's Institute of Technology and is president of the Russian Ufologists Union. Like Dr. Budakov, he agreed to talk with us primarily because we weren't going after all the people who are trying to sell tales to the tabloids. He considered rival ufologists as corrupt and dishonest publicity seekers and not scientists. Varlamov specialized for nearly 30 years in the study of alleged UFO landing sites in Russia, including 10 that are in the direct vicinity of Moscow. And he documented numerous impressive physical characteristics at such sites, if you want to roll the tape. Things that scientists can get out and sink their teeth into, or at least their hands, and do some real scientific work on.
The main thrust of our work is not to contact the space intellect, but to understand how the universe works. We wanted to answer 3 questions. 1, do other worlds and dimensions exist? We have measured 22 physical constants to suggest the answer is yes. 2, do our laws of physics exist in those worlds? No, they don't, and the differences can be documented. 3, can we contact this other intelligence? The answer is yes, but we must be careful. We discovered many measurable characteristics within the landing sites. The plants inside these circles, or impressions, were greatly changed. Plants which were inside the circles contained 20 to 30% more phosphorus and carbon, and they grew at a slower rate. We studied 40 elements in the soil through spectrography. 20 of those elements were found in concentrations 20 to 60 times higher inside the circles than outside. Lead was found to be 14 times as concentrated. Titanium, 8.5 times. Cobalt, barium, and zinc, 3 to 4 times. We also documented physical and psychological effects. Inside the circle, heart rates and blood flow were 60% higher. Our testing equipment also was affected at times. We conducted an experiment to see if the measurement of time might be affected by the energy inside the landing sites. We used both mechanical and crystal timepieces, which were synchronized, then placed both inside and outside of the sites. What we found were that after 2 hours inside the landing sites, time speeded up. The timepieces were no longer synchronized.
You know, that's the way science is supposed to work. You go out, you do experiments, you collect data and try to figure things out. Those are measurable physical characteristics, the time experiment, the chemical composition of the plants in the soil, and it's the kind of thing that we need Western scientists to take more of an interest in doing. Varlamov had a little help in these landing site trace cases, a man named Dr. Yuri Simikov. He's a government biologist employed at one of those long-named government research institutes who we were able to see in 1993. He has recognized some truly amazing phenomena inside alleged UFO landing sites. Dr. Simikov specializes in studying single-cell organisms in the soil, and what he's found at these landing sites is there are none. No bugs in the dirt where UFOs sat down. 2 inches outside the landing site, the soil might teem with microscopic life. Inside, it's another story altogether. Simply barren. By carefully sampling the soil at these sites, Simikov has been able to determine the shape of whatever it is that sets down in the soil. And by going through this dirt and sifting through it very carefully, he also has found something else very interesting. If we can roll the tape again. This even more interesting discovery was made by him at 2 alleged landing sites, hundreds of miles apart, years removed from each other. One of the sites was in Kazakhstan, and one was very close to Moscow. What he found in the soil were these tiny, colorful balls of unknown origin. Neither Simikov nor anyone else, any of his other colleagues, could figure out what the heck they were. He says they contained, in his estimation, they contained the building blocks of life. When placed in water, he said they opened up like seed pods, and he joked that they might be something akin to cosmic sperm. Here is Dr. Simikov discussing some of his other findings.
The single-cell organisms simply leave the sites. They disappear. They don't die. It's as if they were forced to leave the sites. We also experimented with insects. Insects have different receptors than we do. I suspect insects can feel fields not known to us, or fields that are slightly varied. When we placed flies in a dish and put the dish over the landing site, the flies went wild, buzzing and flying around. The balls, I can't find any evidence of their existence in any printed material. They may be formed as a result of transmutation, when oxygen was transformed into sodium under the influence of the UFO, or maybe they are containers to carry life from one planet to another. Still, the objects are not known. One more thing, at the spots where I found the balls, the flies we used in our experiments not only went wild, but were killed, and mosquitoes could be found outside the landing site, but not inside.
You can stop the tape there and put back in the first tape, if you would. Dr. Simikov was kind enough to give me half of the supply of these little spheres that he had. So, in other words, I was able to carry half the world's known supply of cosmic sperm through Russian customs, which is also an adventure. We got back, and I'd like to tell you I've solved this mystery, but I haven't. We put these things through a number of different kinds of tests at a variety of different levels, and no one really has an answer of what they are. We got down to a man named Dr. W.C. Levengood, a biophysicist who's done a lot of work on soil and plant samples from crop circles here in Britain. And he told us, well, what I didn't know is that he had previously worked for a glass company for 15 years. What he said, first of all, these balls are glass. They're not microbial. They're not seed pods. They don't act that way. They are perfect little spheres and are unusually uniform. What's more, they are, in his words, optically perfect. Although glass balls have been made for use as catalysts in chemical reactions in the West, the smallest ones Dr. Levengood had ever seen were 5 times as large as these. Chemical composition is nothing dramatic. There aren't any unknown elements in these things, and he doesn't say that they're impossible to make on Earth, but he said whoever did make them had to go to a lot of trouble to do it. It'd be extremely difficult, extremely expensive, and what the heck were they doing out there in dirt in the middle of Kazakhstan and at another alleged UFO landing site near Moscow? We don't have answers to that. A colleague of his from Cambridge University, Dr. John Getty, had speculated that the spheres might represent some form of advanced communication equipment. He notes that UFO witnesses 30 years ago described and reported what we now recognize as fiber optic systems, and that perhaps this is as an advanced system of that. It's all speculation at this point. I don't have a solid answer for you. The experiences of Simikoff and Varlamov make it abundantly clear that there is data and evidence to study related to UFOs, contrary to what many American scientists would say. It is possible to practice good science while investigating the unknown, but it requires something that far too few American scientists seem to have, and that is an open mind and a little backbone. I wanted to touch on one other subject before wrapping this up, and that's the possibility of other UFO crashes. We've heard several unsubstantiated reports of retrieved material in Russia, but the reports never seem to lead anywhere. One of those reports came from a source of mine, KGB. I did have these conversations with one KGB operative during the first trip who told me that he had read a briefing document which indicated KGB had a plan in motion during the late 1970s to shoot down a UFO so they could study it. But the source said the plan never got off the ground. It didn't matter, though, because while KGB was trying to figure out how to bag a UFO, one was shot down by a military unit at a missile base in Kazakhstan. Again, the source merely says he read this in a briefing. He doesn't claim to have any first-hand knowledge. As a side story, humorous story about KGB, KGB was the one area we were really never able to crack. I'm certain that they have a lot more UFO information that we never gained access to, but I hope to get that someday. But while we were there during the first trip, we went to KGB headquarters. I did the obligatory journalist stand-up out in front of the building, and my colleagues and I had a picture taken out in front. And my name is Knapp. My last initial is K. I was with my friends Brian Gresh and Bryant Blackburn, so KGB. And we thought we were real funny. Let's stand in order. I'll stand here, you guys stand there, get a picture, KGB. Well, we're standing there, and all the Russians who are with us are hiding in the cars. They don't want to be seen out with these crazy Americans who are hassling KGB. So we're laughing. We go back to the car. Great, we got this great photo of us in front of KGB. And yes, KGB got good photo of you, is what Nikolai told us. So there had been, as I said, numerous rumors about other alleged crashes. UFO magazine in the States had one a couple of years ago about a Russian pilot who saw a downed UFO in the city of Monchegorsk. He said Mikhail Gorbachev had made a side trip to take a look at this thing. Interesting in light of what we heard Graham saying about Gorbachev earlier today. They recovered a bizarre metal fragment near the Vashka River in 1976, 3.5-foot metallic ring composed of rare earth elements fabricated through a process unknown on Earth, the scientists said. There is a considerable body of scientific opinion that the famous Tunguska blast was the result of a nuclear explosion on board an alien spaceship that occurred in June 1908. But perhaps the most interesting alleged crash case is known as the Hill 611 case outside the city of Downegorsk. Witnesses reported seeing this reddish sphere fly over a hill, January 1986. It was flying at a low speed, suddenly exploded, virtually atomized itself. This time around, I wanted to make sure we went to Downegorsk and tried to follow up on some of these leads because it was very intriguing, and the British crew agreed. We came to regret that decision considering how tough the trip was. If I could put in the last tape. Just getting to Downegorsk was an adventure. It was a 9.5-hour flight through a blinding snowstorm. We had to get ridiculously drunk to get the nerve to get on the plane. We were packed into a plane with hundreds of Russians, most of whom were drunk out of their minds.
George Knapp, investigative.
This is a report on the trip.
Trip to Russia.
From the port city of Vladivostok, an aging helicopter took us to the even more remote town of Downegorsk, known for its mines, its chemical plants, and the crash on Hill 611. In January 1986, hundreds of witnesses saw a round, red, glowing object before and during the crash. It flew parallel to the mountains, they say, then plunged into the ground, repeatedly bouncing up and down. Valery Dezhilny of the Russian Academy of Sciences was the first to reach the crash site. On the rocks and trees, he found metal fragments unlike those of any meteorite. Under examination, the debris revealed a complex pattern of netting. Most of the material was sent to Academy Institutes for analysis. The debris included several rare earth elements, but no trace of sulfur or phosphorus used in normal industrial processes. Dezhilny also found that flint at the crash site had somehow been magnetized. Something as likely as magnetizing brick, he says. His team report concluded outrageously the object was not made on Earth.
Не помню, но в описании видно.
The prevailing view among skeptics is that the object was a secret Russian satellite. However, the 11 institutes which studied the debris have never formally released their findings or the material. Military sources, including this lieutenant colonel, say there are no records indicating it was a Russian satellite. Dezhilny also notes that no one from the government ever came looking for their lost satellite, although the KGB office in Dalnogorsk did inquire about subsequent UFO sightings. Dozens of UFOs were seen in the weeks and months after the crash, objects which flashed spotlights toward the ground as if searching for something. Most residents saw them, and the general in charge of the Russian Air Force in the region said on television his forces had tracked some of the objects on radar. As in the U.S., there have been other debatable crash reports in Russia, but none with hundreds of living eyewitnesses and none with several pounds of unusual material. George Knapp, Channel 8 Eyewitness News.
George continues his series tomorrow night with a look
No, he
into the
does
Russian
not. We can
government.
stop the tape there. Anyway, as I was saying, just getting to Dalnogorsk was this incredible adventure. It was 9.5 hours, blinding snowstorm, plane full of drunken Russians. We have, this I didn't know, we were served 2 meals, dinner and breakfast on this plane, and both meals were the same thing, well, a wine and chicken with rice. Except for if you want to know the true etiquette of this thing in Russia, you have red wine with chicken and rice for breakfast. It's white wine with chicken and rice for dinner. Flew to Vladivostok, the most crime-ridden seaport in the Far East. We stayed in the nicest hotel in town. It was a virtual bunker. The room service, a list of room services in your room, listed bodyguard service if you were stupid enough to want to go into town by yourself. We chartered that helicopter. That was a great adventure, trying to fly out to the real garden spot, which is just a few miles from the North Korean and also the Chinese borders. But it was worth the trip. Dr. Dezhilny, the first scientist to climb up the hill and take a look at this stuff, still had several samples of it. He had told us about some of the other institutes where it had gone. He told us, although that a lot of people had dismissed this case as being a satellite, the interesting thing is the Russian government never came looking for its satellite, even after reports of this strange crash had been publicized. So that sort of remains a mystery. I think it's probably an overstatement to call it the Russian Roswell, because there's no reports of any kind of alien bodies, but the material that was brought back certainly is not easily explained away. I have a couple of minutes that I didn't expect to have. I want to tell you about someone else who has verified some of our findings, some of the things that we've uncovered in Russia. His name is Philip Corso, Colonel Philip Corso, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about him in the next couple of months. I first met him about 5 years ago, before he was known to anyone in the UFO community. He's now written a book that's going to be coming out in conjunction with the Roswell celebrations. Colonel Corso was a White House intelligence officer who had some fairly incredible experiences during his military career. He is an absolutely credible person, in my estimation. I and some colleagues have gone to great lengths to verify his background. But whatever you think about Bob Lazar, Colonel Corso is who he says he is. He worked where he says he worked, and there's a clear paper trail of it. In addition to working as a White House intelligence officer, he worked under a man named General Arthur Trudeau, who almost single-handedly revamped the entire Army Research and Development Program. Corso says that while working in this program, he sort of had the kook drawer. Odd things all were sent to his office, to his desk, and one of those things was UFOs. And that included as part of his work was a series of files that included, among other things, a computer chip that had been charred, taken out of some wreckage of what he said was a flying saucer, a strange bit of metal that could not be identified, a strange kind of a metallic-looking fabric, and that since his job was research and development, he made up proposals for how to handle this stuff, how to figure out what they were. The material was farmed out in bits and pieces to various national labs, to various defense contractors. The people who received the material were never really told what it was. They were allowed to believe it had been recovered from some crash site of an advanced Russian plane or prototype, and to get on it because the Russians were obviously ahead of us. He gives credit for many of our most profound scientific developments of the 20th century to what was pulled out of Roswell. A lot of people are already attacking Colonel Corso, as occurs in this field. I saw somebody attacking him, somebody from London here, a researcher who attacked him before his book even came out because he once worked for Senator Strom Thurmond, which is true. He briefed Senator Thurman a number of times on the UFO material that he had seen and read over the years, and he did work for Senator Thurman. He was being attacked because Senator Thurman was denounced as a segregationist. Now he's being attacked because Senator Thurman has withdrawn the introduction to Colonel Corso's book. Somebody contacted Senator Thurman's staff, told him this is all about UFOs and aliens, it's going to embarrass you. So right before the book comes out, Senator Thurman announced in the States he's withdrawing his endorsement. In that endorsement, he describes Colonel Corso as a fine American, someone who was loyal and patriotic, who had been in positions to know what was going on in our government at its highest levels. All these laudatory comments that are suddenly, as soon as he starts talking about UFOs, I suppose he's no longer a loyal American, no longer a fine citizen. You know, just toss that out the window. Interesting politics going on there, that now he's being condemned. Before, Colonel Corso was being condemned because he once was associated with Senator Thurman, and now he's being condemned because Senator Thurman doesn't want to associate with him. Anyway, you're going to be hearing a lot more about Colonel Corso, I think in connection with Roswell, although his knowledge about Roswell is fairly limited. He did tell me in connection with the Russian research that it was his estimation that there was an organization like an MJ-12 active in Russia, because when he was attempting to find out some of the things through his Russian contacts that Russians might know about UFOs, he was warned by his contacts that they would be shot if they attempted to find out by some sort of a shadowy organization. Colonel Corso also told me about a dramatic incident that I've been unable to verify, except in bits and pieces, at a Russian missile base. Apparently a series of UFOs appeared over this base. All the bolts in the launch control, the launch panel fell out when these UFOs were over the base, and subsequently there was a gigantic explosion, Plesetsk I think the name of it was, in which several hundred Russian military personnel were killed. Colonel Corso says we had intelligence reports about it that he read that suggested the UFOs had something to do with the explosion, the Russians may have been attempting to initiate some sort of a new weapons program that was particularly dangerous. So he verifies at least part of some of what we said. But you're going to be hearing a lot more about him, and I would just suggest that you keep an open mind about Colonel Corso, because in my estimation, he's a pretty reliable fellow. In summation, tremendous change has swept the former USSR. You know, some people think there may even be a UFO connection for all of that. After all, as we saw earlier today, former U.S. President Ronald Reagan said on 5 different occasions he speculated what would happen if we were confronted with a threat from out there, if there was an alien force. We know that Mikhail Gorbachev responded to that, not only saying that he felt UFOs were real, but yes, we would all band together if we were faced by an outside threat of that nature. In fact, that seems to be what has happened. And a lot of people seem to think that because UFOs have demonstrated their mastery over our ships and planes and nuclear weapons and things of that sort, that this powerful message that's been sent to these 2 world powers, and perhaps to your government as well, has finally been received. Well, now it's as if this pendulum of change in the Soviet Union has swung back. Without anyone issuing any formal orders, the people that we tried to contact have in essence clammed up about UFOs, or they're singing a different tune altogether. When we were there in April of 1996, as I mentioned earlier, Boris Yeltsin was 20 points down in the polls. People were concerned that the communists might regain power or that the nationalists might take over. So maybe their reluctance was understandable. Yeltsin won, but of course his health is so tenuous that the Russian people don't know if he's had a good solid grip on power. They don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Governments do know about UFOs. There's no question about it, after looking at the voluminous files of the Russian Ministry of Defense and at the files of the American government as well. Governments are interested in this topic. They do share information. They do cooperate in a cover-up, probably out of their own desire for self-preservation. We know that they are lying to us. There is no question about that. And I, for one, look forward to the day when they publicly admit it. But I don't think any of us should hold our breath. Thank you very much.
Up.